My dear brothers and sisters, we gather here today not in the comfort of silence, but in the discomfort of truth. For there comes a time in every man's life when silence becomes betrayal, not only of others, but of our deepest moral convictions. That time is now. We are called, not by convenience, but by conscience, to speak out against the great sickness of our age. I speak tonight not with anger, but with anguish, not with condemnation, but with a fierce and faithful love for humanity. For the war in Vietnam is but a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit. It is time we move beyond the narrow confines of nationalism and embrace the broad horizon of brotherhood. For the bombs dropped on Vietnam echo in the streets of Harlem, in the cries of the poor, in the silence of justice deferred. We must break that silence, not in hate but in hope, not in fear but in faith. Let us now begin to name the things we have refused to see. Let us rise to the moral challenge of our time, for if we do not speak now, the stones will cry out. A nation that spends more on war than on uplifting its people is approaching spiritual death. This is not merely a political observation, it is a moral indictment. When the soul of a country becomes so entangled in the machinery of death, when budgets overflow with funds for bombs and bullets but run dry when it comes to books, food, health care, and housing, then we are no longer merely a nation at war. We are a nation at war with its own spirit. We become blind to the pain in our streets while we gaze with fury across distant oceans. The cry of a hungry child in our cities is drowned out by the roar of fighter jets. Our neighbors live in poverty, but our pride lies in firepower. This is not progress. This is a profound loss of direction. There comes a moment when we must ask not just what kind of world we are building, but what kind of people we are becoming. Are we investing in destruction more than in dreams, in weapons more than wisdom? Every dollar that fuels destruction abroad is a dollar stolen from the hands of our elderly, from the education of our children, from the hope of our poor. The bombs we send to Vietnam do not only fall on the faraway jungles. They explode in our ghettos, our schools, our hospitals, our homes. The cost is not only in lives lost overseas, but in lives forgotten here at home. We must ask ourselves, what do we value more, military dominance or moral leadership? Do we believe in power over others or in service to others? A great nation is not judged by the height of its weapons, but by the depth of its compassion. True greatness is found in the ability to lift others up, not in the ability to push others down. When our priorities are so dangerously skewed that we celebrate missiles while ignoring malnourished children, then we have lost not only our way, but our very soul. Let us not confuse strength with violence or courage with conquest. The courage we need today is not the courage to kill, but the courage to care. It takes no wisdom to drop bombs, but it takes great wisdom to lift the broken-hearted. We have become so obsessed with enemies abroad that we have forgotten the injustice next door. While we pour billions into battlefields, our communities suffer, our people struggle, our cities decay. Our soldiers return home not to parades and purpose, but to poverty and pain. If we are to survive not just as a nation, but as a moral force in the world, we must reverse the engines of destruction and invest in the engines of dignity. The soul of America is not nourished by napalm. It is nourished by nurturing. Let us remember that a government that feeds war before it feeds its people is a government in moral crisis. The true measure of a nation is not in its arsenal, but in its ability to care for the least among us. When the war budget outgrows the welfare of the people, the spirit of the nation begins to rot. We are not merely killing others, we are killing the very heart of who we claim to be. Silence in the face of injustice is not neutrality, it is complicity. Too many of us have been taught that to remain silent is to remain safe, that to speak out is to invite trouble, to disturb the peace. But there can be no true peace where injustice reigns. Silence may protect the speaker, but it abandons the oppressed. It creates the illusion of distance, as if the pain of others does not concern us, as if we can live untouched by the suffering we choose not to see. But injustice, like fire, spreads. What scorches one corner today may consume the whole tomorrow. And the silence of good people, of thoughtful men and women, is the dry kindling that feeds its flames. We cannot tell ourselves that silence is wisdom when it becomes a weapon for the status quo. We cannot remain mute while children are bombed, while families are broken, while young men are shipped to fight wars they did not choose, while the poor are left behind and the rich grow richer from suffering. In moments like these, silence becomes betrayal, betrayal of truth, betrayal of our deepest moral values, betrayal of the brotherhood that binds us together. To say nothing in the face of wrong is to stand on the side of wrong, even if we wear the robes of respectability and speak the language of civility. There is a power in words, a responsibility in voice, that we dare not neglect. When we witness evil and choose to say nothing, we are not neutral, we are choosing the side that benefits from our inaction. And it is often not hatred that enables injustice to survive, but indifference. It is not always the roar of tyrants that destroys nations, but the silence of those who knew better and failed to act. History will not only remember the brutality of the wicked, but the quietness of the good. We must not be afraid to name what is wrong. We must not be afraid to stand against policies that prioritize profit over people, that value domination over dignity. The war in Vietnam is not merely a military conflict. It is a reflection of moral collapse. And those who see it, who feel the weight of it, who understand its injustice, must not bite their tongues. They must not hide behind the false comfort of apolitical lives, for there is no such thing as neutrality in a moral crisis. There is no such thing as standing apart when the world is bleeding. Our silence does not absolve us, it implicates us. When we close our mouths, we close our hearts. When we refuse to speak, we refuse to heal. And a world in pain does not need passive observers, it needs brave witnesses. It needs people willing to lift their voices, to disrupt the silence, to declare that justice must be louder than comfort, that truth must be bolder than fear. Let us not wait for a convenient time to speak. Let us not wait for permission to do what is right. The time to raise our voices is always now, because if we do not speak out when injustice calls our names, when will we? If we do not rise for others, who will rise for us? True peace is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of justice, compassion, and humanity. Peace is not a silent battlefield where weapons cease but suffering continues. It is not the cold stillness after bombs have fallen and blood has dried. True peace breathes life into broken homes, lifts up the forgotten, and restores dignity where it has been denied. It does not wait for conflict to end. It begins when we dare to love our enemies, feed the hungry, clothe the poor, and build systems that honor every human soul. It is not satisfied with empty truces, but demands the fullness of equality, fairness, and truth. To speak of peace while ignoring poverty is to speak in vain. To speak of peace while entire communities are silenced by oppression is to speak without understanding. A ceasefire in Vietnam means little if the same violence lives in our inner cities, if racial injustice persists in our institutions, if economic disparity keeps millions in bondage. True peace cannot exist in a society where some sleep under golden roofs and others sleep in the streets. It cannot exist where some dine in excess while others beg for crumbs. It is not merely political, it is deeply personal, deeply moral. True peace calls us to confront not only the wars abroad, but the wars within. The war between selfishness and sacrifice, between greed and generosity, between silence and speaking out. We must examine the structures that make war profitable and peace inconvenient. We must ask ourselves why our leaders find it easier to mobilize for battle than to mobilize for brotherhood. Why we can spend billions to kill but hesitate to spend to heal. Why the cries of the suffering are ignored until they are loud enough to shake the very foundations of our comfort. To pursue true peace is to be courageous. It is to love when it would be easier to hate. It is to forgive when vengeance calls louder. It is to build bridges when walls seem safer. True peace is a daily act of resistance against apathy, against despair, against the lie that some lives matter more than others. It is not found in treaties alone, but in classrooms that teach truth, in workplaces that honor dignity, in homes where every child feels safe and valued. Peace begins when we stop dehumanizing others. When we see in the eyes of strangers the reflection of our own hopes and fears. When we understand that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. It begins when we stop measuring security by the number of weapons we possess and start measuring it by the number of people we have lifted out of suffering. Peace is not found in silence. It is found in courageous dialogue. Not in retreat. It is found in relentless compassion. True peace is a revolution of the heart. It demands that we see beyond borders, beyond race, beyond class, beyond creed. It compels us to rise above the narrow confines of nationalism and embrace the worldwide fellowship of humanity. It is not passive, it is powerful, it breaks chains, it heals wounds, it transforms enemies into neighbors and strangers into brothers. Peace is not the end goal, it is the path, and that path begins wherever there is justice, wherever there is mercy, wherever love dares to speak louder than fear. The enemy is not just overseas, it is racism, poverty, and militarism within our own soul. We often look outward to identify threats, pointing fingers across oceans and borders, but the true danger lies much closer to home. It is not only found in the jungles of Vietnam or the deserts of distant lands, but in the neglected neighborhoods of our own cities, in the hunger on our streets, in the division sown by prejudice, and in the quiet approval of systems that destroy the spirit while pretending to protect the nation. The war we wage abroad is mirrored by a deeper war within, a war against our own conscience, against the ideals we claim to cherish. We have been taught to fear external enemies, to brace ourselves against foreign ideologies, yet we ignore the daily violence that is tolerated in our communities. Racism continues to poison our institutions, from the schools that fail our children to the courts that deny justice to the oppressed. Poverty shackles millions in chains of despair, not because we lack resources, but because we lack the will to prioritize people over profits. And militarism, dressed in patriotic slogans, drains our compassion and glorifies force as a solution to every problem. We have allowed the love of power to replace the power of love. The real enemy is not one man or one country. It is a mindset, a spiritual disease that sees violence as strength and silence as wisdom. It is a sickness that separates us by skin color, by income, by nationality, while blinding us to our shared humanity. It is the voice that says, "Let others suffer, as long as I am safe." And it is the policy that says, "Let us spend for weapons before we spend for healing." We must confront these enemies with more urgency than any foreign conflict, for they are eating away at our foundation from within. Racism is not simply hatred, it is systemic indifference to suffering based on skin. It is woven into the fabric of policies and practices that continue to advantage some while leaving others behind. Poverty is not simply lack, it is structured neglect. It is the deliberate absence of opportunity, the quiet theft of dignity through low wages, poor education, and denied health care. And militarism is not simply defense, it is obsession. It is the distortion of priorities, the addiction to arms that blinds us to diplomacy, that silences the voice of peace, that praises destruction more than reconstruction. We must recognize that these enemies are connected. Where there is poverty, there is often the shadow of racism. Where there is racism, there is a justification for violence. Where militarism rises, the cries of the poor and oppressed are drowned out. These forces do not operate independently. They form a triad of moral decay that must be dismantled if we are to move forward as a just and loving society. To fight these enemies, we must first name them. We must look inward with honesty and outward with empathy. We must stop excusing injustice with comfort and stop masking indifference with neutrality. The healing of our world begins with the healing of our nation, and that healing begins with the courage to face our internal foes. The battle for peace is not just across the ocean. It is in our hearts, in our homes, and in our unwillingness to accept anything less than a full measure of justice for all. Conscience must become louder than the drumbeat of war. In every age there comes a moment when the moral voice of humanity must rise above the noise of nationalism, beyond the pressure of politics, and speak with clarity that transcends fear. We live in a time where war has become routine, where the sounds of missiles and the silence of indifference echo louder than the cries of the innocent. But no government, no army, no ideology has the right to drown out the voice of conscience. For conscience is the divine whisper in the soul of every man and woman. It is the voice that reminds us we are not made for violence, but for compassion, not for conquest, but for community. Too long have we been taught to equate strength with silence and patriotism with obedience. We have been told to trust in strategies and generals more than in love and truth. But when the call to war drowns out the call to justice, we must remember that moral courage is greater than military might. The time has come to listen not to the war rooms, but to the classrooms, the prayer rooms, the hospital wards, the homeless shelters. It is there that the voice of conscience speaks most clearly. It tells us that every bomb dropped on foreign soil explodes in the hearts of our children. It tells us that every act of violence against another people leaves a scar upon our own humanity. Conscience does not come wrapped in flags or backed by budgets. It does not seek approval or applause. It speaks even when it is unpopular. It speaks even when it costs us friends, followers, or fame. It speaks because it must. It reminds us that being human means feeling the pain of others as our own, that we cannot truly live while others are dying at the hands of our silence, that no policy, no political gain, no economic interest can justify the shedding of innocent blood. We must learn once again to trust that voice within us that trembles when we see injustice, that aches when we witness suffering. The world has enough strategists. It needs prophets. It needs peacemakers who are not afraid to say no when the world says yes to war. It needs citizens who will raise their voices in love, not because it is easy, but because it is right. The drumbeat of war is loud, but the heartbeat of conscience must be louder still. The courage to listen to conscience is not weakness. It is the highest form of strength. It calls us to build, not destroy, to unite, not divide. It demands that we measure our greatness not by how many enemies we can defeat, but by how many lives we can protect. Conscience challenges us to imagine a world where children grow up without the shadow of bombs overhead, where leaders are remembered not for their military victories, but for their moral vision. Let us not be seduced by the noise of war, nor be numbed by its repetition. Let us be disturbed by the suffering it causes, awakened by the injustice it perpetuates, and moved to action by the truth it tries to silence. The call of conscience may not be the loudest voice, but it is the clearest, the truest, the most sacred. Now is the time to transform protest into purpose and war cries into cries for healing. We are living through a moment that demands more than slogans, more than speeches. It demands a deep, unshakable commitment to rebuild what has been broken, to right what has been wrong, to lift up what has been left behind. Protest, while powerful, must be more than the sound of anger. It must become the song of vision. Our marching feet must not only tread the streets of injustice, but pave the roads to a new moral future. We cannot be content with merely naming the problem. We must become the living solution. For too long, the cries of war have dominated our world. We have sent sons into battlefields with promises of honor, while ignoring the silent battles they face upon returning home. We have glorified the machinery of destruction while neglecting the miracle of human dignity. But those who truly love peace cannot remain satisfied with protest alone. The moral arc of the universe does not bend itself. We must take hold of it. We must shape it with hands that heal, hearts that forgive, and voices that refuse to remain silent. Purpose is what gives protest power. It is the reason behind the resistance, the soul behind the stand. It tells us that we are not simply saying no to violence. We are saying yes to something far greater. Yes to education instead of annihilation. Yes to feeding the hungry instead of funding destruction. Yes to building communities rather than bombing them. When protest is shaped by purpose, it no longer shouts into the void, it speaks into the future. It becomes the blueprint for justice, the map for mercy, the light for the next generation to follow. The cries for healing must rise louder than the drums of division. We must become a people who understand that true strength lies not in domination, but in restoration. That real patriotism is not found in defending every war, but in defending the right of every child to grow up in peace. Healing does not come through silence. It comes through action, deliberate, courageous, compassionate action. It comes when we feed the hungry, visit the prisoner, comfort the widow, and welcome the stranger. It comes when we put the poor at the center of our policies, when we put love at the center of our politics. The world is waiting not just for our outrage, but for our outpouring of love. It is waiting for leaders who will carry not just plans, but principles, not just courage, but conscience. It is waiting for ordinary people, teachers, students, artists, workers, to rise up and declare that this time, this moment, will not be like the ones before, that we will not allow the cycles of hate to repeat, that we will become the peacemakers, the bridge builders, the restorers of the breach. This is the time to channel our pain into purpose, our anger into advocacy, our wounds into wisdom. Let our protests build schools. Let our resistance bring clean water. Let our demands birth new laws that lift the fallen instead of crushing them further. We are being called not just to react, but to respond with clarity, with vision, with the fierce determination that love is still the most powerful force on earth.